Hey guys! Tonight we begin with a very relaxed drift through history, focusing on queens who didn't exactly get the fairy tale ending. So, dim your lights, settle into a comfortable chair or bed, maybe grab something warm to sip on, and let's meander through the lives of royal women who, for one reason or another, found themselves quietly exiled from the centers of power they were born to inhabit. We're not here for battles or shocking betrayals. Instead, we're floating gently through dynastic weirdness, awkward marriages, and the soft, slow tragedy of being sidelined. Let's start with Empress Matilda, daughter of Henry I of England, also known as Maud, to those who prefer slightly more casual insults. She was, in many ways, the obvious heir to her father's throne after the early death of her brother William. Of course, being obvious didn't mean it was going to happen smoothly, because medieval succession loved nothing more than ignoring logic. Instead, the crown went to her cousin Stephen. Matilda spent much of her life in a state of quiet agitation, organizing armies, negotiating with allies, occasionally scaring men in armor into doing the right thing. But the English crown remained just out of reach. Exile, in her case, was a mix of physical movement across estates and political sidelining. She was queen in spirit, and sometimes on paper, but in practice, she lived in a liminal space of almost power, which is arguably more exhausting than outright dethronement. Now, let's float over to Margaret of Anjou, who married Henry VI of England. Henry was gentle, indecisive, and occasionally convinced he was doing the right thing while simultaneously doing everything wrong. Margaret, in contrast, had a spine of steel and an uncanny ability to manage the disaster that was her husband's reign. During the Wars of the Roses, she effectively became the glue holding the Lancastrian faction together, which sounds heroic, except that eventually she was exiled after losing most of her battles. She ended up in France, quietly tending to her estates, sending letters, and probably sighing a lot while imagining that she had the patience of a saint. Margaret's exile wasn't brutal. It was slow, administrative, and filled with plenty of moments to reflect on how much time and energy she had spent managing people who really didn't deserve it. Next, we drift to Isabella of France, often called the she-wolf of France. She married Edward II of England, who was, well, let's just say he had bad instincts in almost every area of governance. He also had favorites, which was standard practice for monarchs, but somehow made Isabella's life dramatically harder. Eventually, she collaborated with Roger Mortimer to depose Edward, which sounds satisfying and dramatic. But after the coup, Isabella's own influence slowly waned. She spent her later years watching her son Edward III rule, gradually fading from the spotlight she had briefly commanded. This form of exile is subtle, no dungeons, no chains, just an elegant, almost polite removal from authority, leaving her free to walk corridors, attend ceremonies, and reflect on her past ambitions. One interesting thing about these queens is that exile rarely meant complete isolation. It was often a mix of geography, politics, and gentle sidelining. Catherine de' Medici provides a perfect example. She wasn't exiled outright, but her power ebbed and flowed in such a way that by the time her sons came of age, her influence was largely ceremonial. She had survived the chaos of multiple civil wars, managed her family's delicate alliances, and ensured the continuity of her children's rule. But the court gradually sidelined her. Exile can take many forms. Sometimes it's a physical move to an estate. Sometimes it's simply being present but invisible, a kind of social invisibility cloak that court etiquette makes perfectly polite. From France, let's drift a bit east to Blanche of Navarre, queen in the 14th century. Blanche became regent for her young son, navigating a court filled with competing noble factions, financial stress, and legal disputes over land. Eventually, pressure mounted, and she retreated from active political life, effectively exiled in her own domains. The quiet dignity of her withdrawal is almost meditative. Imagine spending decades negotiating, petitioning, and managing crises, only to quietly step aside when the factions surrounding you decide your energy is no longer required. It's subtle, almost sleepy, but undeniably poignant. Moving to the Italian peninsula, Marie de' Medici married Henry IV of France and acted as regent for her young son, Louis XIII. For a while, she was very involved in politics, endlessly maneuvering through a court that seemed to delight in undermining her at every turn. Eventually, her son assumed full control, and she was gently pushed aside, exiled to various estates across Europe. The gentle monotony of her later life, writing, supporting the arts, and occasionally complaining about her son's decisions, fits a recurring theme in exiled queens, a shift from public power to private persistence. Their days were full, but slower, filled with routine, reflection, and occasional regret. Now, Joanna of Castile, or Joanna the Mad, deserves attention. Her story is complicated. She married Philip the Handsome, and after his untimely death, her father and later her son considered her too unstable to rule. She was confined, often in luxurious residences, for decades. Joanna's exile wasn't dramatic in the conventional sense, but it was an emotional slow fade. Her influence was effectively nullified, and she spent her days wandering palaces under supervision, observing events from a distance she couldn't affect. There's a strange calmness to this kind of exile, a rhythm of gentle observation that almost lulls the mind into quiet reflection. Exiled queens sometimes found ways to create personal projects that sustained them. Anne of Bohemia, for example, married Richard II of England and eventually lived a life removed from central power. She cultivated art, fashion, and culture in her exiled residences. Exile, in her case, was less a punishment and more a chance to shape identity outside the constant scrutiny of court life. It's a gentle form of autonomy, a way to quietly influence the world without commanding armies or passing laws. It's worth pausing here and noticing a recurring pattern. Exile is rarely violent, dramatic, or sudden. It's often slow, administrative, and socially constructed. These queens lived long enough to witness the world moving on without them, their influence quietly fading like the slow setting of a sun over an endless palace courtyard. Some found ways to exert subtle power, others settled into personal pursuits. In every case, there's a gentle rhythm, a lull that's oddly soothing to imagine. We can't talk about exiled queens without mentioning the Byzantine Empire. Byzantine princesses and empresses often faced a particular variety of exile, being sent to distant palaces or convents to remove them from political contention. Eudokia Makrembolitissa, for example, married twice, acted as regent, and navigated a court filled with intrigue. Eventually, the political tides shifted, and she retreated from the center of power. Exile here was about survival as much as it was about removal. She spent her later years quietly in her residences, orchestrating minor court affairs, tending to family, and watching younger, more ambitious rulers take the stage. Similarly, Theodora, wife of Emperor Theophilos, faced subtle exile after her husband's death. While she retained some ceremonial privileges, real power passed to others. Her influence became symbolic rather than practical, and she spent her days engaged in private patronage, religious devotion, and the occasional political consultation. Again, the exile is gentle, almost lulling in its monotony, but undeniably a shift from vibrant authority to quiet observation. Even in later centuries, queens faced a similar fate. Elizabeth Stuart, the Winter Queen, became Queen of Bohemia for a very brief time before political misfortune forced her into prolonged exile. She moved through European courts, surviving wars, political disputes, and personal losses, while never regaining the throne she briefly held. Her life in exile involved long journeys, quiet negotiation, and careful diplomacy, all underscored by a sense of inevitability. She existed in a liminal space, neither fully queen nor entirely private citizen, a state that can feel strangely hypnotic when considered in its slow, daily details. And so, as we float through these stories, we see a common thread. Queens were exiled not necessarily because of personal failings, but because dynastic shifts, political convenience, or gender norms dictated it. Their days became measured, repetitive, and introspective. Some found solace in gardens, art, and letters. Others persisted through subtle influence, while some simply drifted along in quiet resignation. There's a hypnotic rhythm to the slow fading of authority, a gentle echo of the dynasties they helped shape and could no longer control.